Hello and welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles. I'm Katie Babick, your guide to history's biggest disasters.
And I'm Aaron Babick, the guy usually just along for the ride.
Today, we're diving into the Great Smog of 1952, a disaster that choked London, changed lives, and reshaped environmental policy.
So sit back and take a deep breath. Just not too deep. Now let's get into it.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone. We are so excited to be here.
What are we talking about this week?
We are talking about the Great Smog of 1952 in London.
To be clear, this is not J.R.R. Tolkien's writings.
Nope, not at all. Does he have something about smog? What do I miss?
The Hobbit.
Is there smog in The Hobbit?
Okay, Smaug, the dragon.
God, Aaron. No, this is the Great Smog, smoke and fog. And what actually made me really think about it was our trip to California this summer. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
So when we were in California this summer, we went to visit Aaron's family in Bakersfield. And while we were there, my very sweet mother-in-law, husband, kids, and I all went up to Yosemite. And then when we were driving back into Bakersfield,
You could see the blanket.
I could see just this, it looks like a giant cloud bank, a little yellowy and whatnot, but it looks like a
It's
big
not a
cloud
cloud.
bank. I asked them, oh, is it going to rain? Like, do you get thunderstorms here? Because I didn't remember thunderstorms in Bakersfield. And sweet Aaron and sweet Norma both looked at me like, oh, summer child.
I'm
It is
surprised
dark
you don't
here.
remember it from growing up in California.
Well, I mean, I grew up in I grew up in California, but I grew up in San Diego. And San Diego does not get smog like the Central Valley does.
I mean, that's true. Your smog just blows inland.
We get fog, real fog, but that gloomy pollutionist stuff is reserved for certain landscapes, really. And the Central Valley is one of the most polluted areas in the world. Bakersfield, I think, is like the number 1 or number 2, something like that in the United States.
Yeah, they surpassed another city like a couple years ago.
It's pretty brutal. And so, I was thinking about it. The kids and I were talking about Yosemite and about Bakersfield, and I was remembering how much that ended up really hurting my throat. And then, like, all 4 of our kids either had pneumonia or were coming down with pneumonia or were recovering from pneumonia that trip. And you could tell when we came back into Bakersfield on that day how much worse it was for their lungs. So at any rate, that's what we're talking about today. To celebrate that, I made delicious smoked old fashions.
They are delicious. Though I am laughing a bit here at how many of my whiskey rocks you used in each glass. I think you put 10 in my glass.
I thought Aaron has multiple bags of whiskey rocks in the fridge or in the freezer. I thought you were just supposed to put a bag in per glass. Now I know. I'm not the one who drinks whiskey or bourbon or anything with whiskey rocks in this house. I drink my fruity drinks and I'm happy.
These are delicious.
Good. I'm glad. On that note, we should maybe get rolling. I don't know. What do you think?
Roll it in.
Roll it in?
Fog.
Like the fog. I like that. You're clever. So I'm starting with a quote again, because apparently that's what I do. I think that may
I
be
like
the thing.
Quotes.
Good. This one is my favorite so far.
I want to hear it.
Brace yourself. Hold on to your hat.
I'm not wearing a hat.
Put on a hat. I could not move for 4 days without the greatest distress. I must have been very bad indeed, for my wife actually held my hand and said she was sorry for me. This is proof enough that I looked as if... Stop it, let me finish. That I looked as if I was going to kick the bucket. What are our wonderful scientists doing? In an age of jet propulsion, atomic energy, and all the miracles of modern science at which we marvel, these wretched people can't solve the problem of a lousy fog? A letter from Dr. Beckel to the Ministry of Health, 13th of December, 1952.
I'm sitting here wondering what his relationship with his wife was like, that she actually held my hand and
I don't know.
said she was sorry for me.
I was sitting here thinking that feels really familiar. I love you so much. But if
Maybe
I were
she
to
just thought he had a man cold.
I mean, don't we all think that? when our man hasn't moved for 4 days in the, quote, greatest distress. I love you. Just kidding. So that letter was written to the Ministry of Health by Dr. Beckel after the Great Smog, when the Ministry of Health was putting out like surveys and whatnot to kind of figure out what happened. And you can kind of get a picture of how British doctors felt after this phenomenon.
Oh, I'm sure it was a lovely time for them.
They were not happy. Fog in London, or smog, has a long history, a lot longer than you would think of. The term smog wasn't actually developed until 1905, so I'm going to be using smog and fog kind of interchangeably here because that's how it was used over the centuries of which we're going to be talking about.
Okay.
Wood was the main source of like domestic heating in general, up until the 13th century. The 13th century is when they started using coal.
Ah, okay. Yeah, so burn coal, keep yourself warm. And just like Lewis Carroll's Christmas Carol.
Yep, we're going to be talking about that a bit, actually.
Where Bob Cratchit's trying to buy coal to heat his home for the holidays.
Except we're talking the Dark Ages, Middle Ages. Up until the Middle Ages, they used wood, but as the city really got bigger, all of the wood was chopped down to make houses. And then people started finding something called sea coal that was washed ashore, either on the Thames or on different oceans. And they realized that when they burned that, it made a lot of heat and they didn't need wood. They could use the coal. Now, this coal burned dirty from the very beginning. It was disgusting. It was disgusting enough that at one point in 1257, the royal family was forced to evacuate a castle in Nottingham because burning fuel caused so many noxious fumes they couldn't breathe.
I'm sure they left everyone else behind, though.
No, actually, the entire castle was evacuated. They did leave the villagers and peasants and towns.
That's who I was talking about.
Yeah, that's fair. They started trying to ban coal as early as 1272. King Edward I.
That's a long time ago.
A very long time ago. He banned it. Essentially, it wasn't an official ban, but he threatened to execute and torture anyone who used it.
What did he use?
I don't know. That's a good question. Unsurprisingly, though, the threats didn't work because using intimidation without giving solutions is not an effective way to govern. Shocking.
Figure.
I know. The next 400 years, air quality steadily got worse and worse. In that time, Richard III and Henry V both also tried to ban sea coal.
So this whole time, it's just been sea coal, not like mined coal, like from Aberban.
Yep, it was primarily sea coal up until about the Industrial Revolution. There was coal mines forming before the Industrial Revolution, but that's really when we start mining and mining and mining, and we're getting
there was
straight up coal.
Enough of this stuff just washing up, that it was prevalent enough to be that widely used to kill the air quality.
So the air quality started going down then. The air quality wasn't killed or really bad until about the 16th century. That's when air quality got to the point that we started seeing these fogs that were wiping people out. Because it's a fog over a city is very different than a castle being filled with fumes because maybe their chimneys aren't working super well. The air quality got worse and worse over time.
So poor chimney design led to them evacuating Nottingham. But, continue.
So by the 15th century, that's when we start having London and parts of England overcome by what was called at the time Great Stinking Fogs. They called them Great Stinking Fogs because they literally did stink. The fog was filled with a lot of sulfur and sulfur dioxide, which smells like rotten eggs.
Yep.
And sometimes smells like, a burnt match. That's just kind of icky. So they called them Great Stinking Fogs. During that time, there's been research since the 1952 smog, specifically Peter Brimblecombe. They looked at the number of deaths that were notated and compared those to when the fogs were said to arrive. And it was obvious from that research that more people died during the fogs, even in the 15th century, than did when there weren't fogs. So the fogs have been killing people in England since the 15th century. During the 1600s, the fog started getting so bad that it was blocking enough of the sunlight that over half the children in the city had rickets because they weren't getting enough vitamin D.
Oh my God. Wasn't there a movie about this? I think it was called The Fog.
I don't know. I haven't heard of that one, but that's worth looking into. One of the earliest works on anti-pollution was in 1661, written by John Evelyn. He called on King Charles II and Parliament to do something about the burning of coal in London because it was so bad. John Evelyn wanted to move all coal burning 5 to 6 miles away from the center of London so that there wouldn't be as much smoke in the city.
And how would people stay warm?
I think he just kind of figured they'd figure it out or they'd come up with something else. They didn't really have any good solutions, even up to this disaster, which is part of how we got there at this point. Religious leaders were executed over coal during the 1600s as well. Yep. One in particular, the Archbishop of Canterbury fined several coal-burning brewers, so people who are using coal to light fires to brew beer, so that he could repair the smoke damage on St. Paul's Cathedral. He wanted to use the fines for that. He was beheaded for this in 1645.
People really liked their coal.
People really liked coal. By the industrial era, in the 1700s, coal really was king, and the environment was already irrevocably damaged. These furnaces fueled the colonial empire. Even by the 1700s, though, there was clean air people, still people that were trying to protect the environment. One of them was Lord Elmerston, and a quote from him was, and this is, again, in the 1700s, "The interests of the few are opposed to the interests of the many. 100 gentlemen connected to these furnaces wish to make 2 million of their fellow citizens swallow their smoke." By this point in the 1700s, 90 days out of the year, the city was completely enveloped in the smog.
That's gross.
The smog of 1952 is exactly what you picture. It was just death fog that floated down on London. There's multiple cases of this. In 1873, a fog smothered the city for days and definitely killed at least 300 people. In 1879, fog blanketed the light from the city for over 4 months.
4 months?
4
Good
months.
God.
And to kind of get back to what you were saying about Lewis Carroll, this smog was really kind of romanticized in the Victorian era. It became a literary plot point. For example, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, one of your favorites, they would use the fog in London to kind of show Mr. Jekyll was around when it was very foggy, but Mr. Hyde, the good side, would come out when it was light. Another author who used it was T.S. Eliot. He talked about how the fog was like a yellow cat that wrapped around the city. Charles Dickens used it to great effect in multiple of his novels. And Impressionist artists during the Victorian era really loved the fog too. Monet in particular. Monet would visit London just so that he could paint during these great fog events. Monet said, "Without the fog, London would not be a beautiful city. It is the fog that gives it its magnificent breadth. Those massive rectangular blocks become grandiose within that mysterious cloak."
Did these painters, writers, know that it was killing people?
I think everyone kind of knew, but didn't really own it. And it was also just in general kind of regarded as the price of progress. That without coal, we didn't have industry. And without industry, we weren't moving forward. So it was dark and mysterious and romanticized in multiple different ways. Because again, I mean, picture like when you see movies or little shorts of Jack the Ripper, they're almost all very romanticized and they're almost all cloaked in this fog that does not naturally exist in London. And despite the fact that Jack the Ripper never killed anyone on anything other than a bright and shining day, we still picture it in this cloak of fog, this cloak of smog. That's how we picture old-timey London for the most part, is this dreary, foggy, mysterious city.
Jack the Ripper killed people in the light of day?
I mean, no, but it wasn't during fogs. Fog events, smog events, were not exclusive to England either, and not exclusive to London, obviously. As the Industrial Revolution continued its path forward and more countries began to get on board with that, we started having and seeing more of these air pollution events. A couple of really notable ones that impact our story was number one, in 1930 in December, in Meuse Valley, Belgium. This is one of the most industrialized areas in Europe. There was an anticyclone, which we're going to go over more later in this episode. An anticyclone settled over the area and acted like a lid and caused a fog almost exactly like what happens in our story. And it trapped all of the pollution from the steel mills, coke ovens, and foundries. It killed about 60 people. And afterwards, the Belgian government had an inquiry into the event and found that the gases were almost as deadly as the gases that were used in World War I.
Okay, that's
pretty brutal. Prior to October 26, 1948, Donora, Pennsylvania was no stranger to the damages that smog can cause to an area. at that point, before their particular disaster, the smog from their zinc plant and a couple other factories in the area had killed enough of the vegetation around that whenever it rained, particularly on the cemetery in this small town, it would wash away the cemetery and actually wash off bits of dead bodies because it had washed off so much of the topsoil.
That's gross.
On October
20th,
it's really bad. On October 26, 1948, though, they had a fog that settled down on the city and lasted for 5 days. This city actually did a fair bit. They created a field hospital in the basement of their community center. They put in a makeshift morgue. They evacuated a lot of people. But despite that, over 20 people died. Both of those events triggered a lot of international support for trying to understand air pollution. Particularly the United States and Canada started a big inquiry into what happened and how we can prevent it from happening again in the future. So there was, before 1952, a lot of awareness of the environmental problems that coal can cause. There was some attempts to constrain coal usage, but there was a ton of pushback from the British government because they were in tons of debt from World War II. They didn't want to get rid of coal. They didn't want to deal with this. In fact, 6 months before the disaster, Harold Macmillan refused calls to create smokeless zones, which was one of the things that the report from the United States and Canada recommended, and refused to try and lower air pollution in London, saying it would be too expensive and it wasn't worth the time.
Sounds like a great guy.
Yeah, you're going to really love him by the time this story's done.
Wait, remind me of his name so I can...
Harold Macmillan.
Macmillan. Okay, got it.
So that brings us to 1952. In the beginning of 1952, King George VI died February 6th after 15 years of ruling. And that brought in our favorite queen, Queen Elizabeth II.
Oh, hey!
And just a fun little side note, this disaster coincides with the very beginning of her reign. One of the documentaries that I watched for research for this was something called The Great Killer Smog. And The Great Killer Smog was set to air on September 8th, 2022. Any idea what happened that day?
September 8th, 2022. Oh my gosh, is that when she...
That's when the Queen died.
Passed away.
That's when the Queen died. So they actually, because in Britain, when a monarch dies, when the Queen died, they just stopped all programming. The TVs were just blank. So they did not actually air it that day because she died that day. They didn't air it until September 13th, 2022. I thought that was just kind of a weird, cool coincidence that this happened in the very beginning of her reign. And then a big documentary about it wasn't able to air at the end of her reign because she passed away.
That is interesting.
Right? Here we are. We've got the new Queen Elizabeth, a young, beautiful woman. This story is set 7 years after World War II. World War II ended in 1945. So to just kind of put a picture on it, because I love these perspective things, anyone over the age of 35 in London at this point had lived through 2 world wars.
Wow.
Isn't that hard to picture? Weird to picture?
Yeah.
London,
that's a very unique way of putting that.
But it really makes you realize just how shell-shocked a lot of this population was. London was still being rebuilt. There was still bombed-out neighborhoods. It was only 7 years after. There were still homes that were destroyed from the air blitzes. Not only that, the country was in absolutely massive amounts of debt. Winston Churchill had just been reelected in no small part because people wanted to kind of tackle that debt, and they thought conservative government would do a better job of that. Rationing was still in full effect. People couldn't buy as much coal as they wanted. They couldn't buy as much sugar as they wanted. They couldn't buy as much, pretty much anything as they wanted because everything was still being rationed. While the country was trying to tackle...
You said 7 years after and they're still rationing?
They're still rationing with the plan of rationing until 1958.
Oh my God.
On top of that, they were spending a lot of money because they had a bunch of soldiers with the United States in Korea.
Right.
Yep. One of the only industries that was still doing incredibly well was coal.
Coal.
It was pretty much the only thriving international industry. Over 250 million tons were mined domestically every single year, with over 700,000 people working in the mines. So the British government was using this to try and pay down their war debts. They would export all of the good coal, all of the high-quality coal. And they kept the low-quality coal at home.
Wow.
Yep. So the low-quality coal was called nutty slack by most Londoners. And this was almost literally just like dust. And it burned terribly. It was an incredibly inefficient coal. It created significantly more smoke and therefore more pollution in the atmosphere. It took a lot more to be able to warm your home using nutty slag, but that's what the majority of Londoners had because good coal was pretty strictly rationed. Nutty slag, on the other hand, you could buy as much as you want of nutty slag. Now, the summer of 1952 was rough as fuck for England. Queen Elizabeth, I wanted to say these because I just was like kind of blown away about how bad her first year of queening went.
So this was her first year. Got it.
Her first year. So in August.
Rough.
Really rough. In August, there was a tropical storm that hit the south of England. There was 9 inches of rain within 24 hours. It completely wiped out the town of Lynmouth and 35 people died. The entire town had to be rebuilt.
Okay.
A couple of weeks after that, at the Farnborough Air Show, pilot John Derry was going to try and break the sound barrier for the second time. And he did it. He was sweeping over the crowds. He broke the sound barrier, and on his second flight back, the entire plane disintegrated and fell apart onto the crowd of onlookers.
Oh my God.
It killed 31 spectators and prompted a large response of how to protect audiences at air shows.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because it's
a rough as shit month.
But also protect your audiences at the air show, maybe not make sure your airplane doesn't fall apart.
Apparently. I mean, that's what my research said, that the legislation was to protect audiences at air shows.
I mean, fair point.
Oh.
Protect them, but also maybe build better aircraft.
A month after that, Harrow and Wealdstone had a really bad day. One of their passenger trains ended up missing a warning signal and then 2 more danger signals in the smog that was going on at the time. It crashed into another passenger train that was parked and sent that passenger train onto the tracks of another oncoming train, which crashed into that. So there's a 3-train pileup, killing over 100 passengers and injuring 350 more.
I never thought I would ever hear the words 3-train pileup.
Neither did I, which is why I had to include it in this episode, because that's happening in, I think it's the end of September that happened, and this disaster starts on December 5th. So, like, queening is not going well for Lizzie.
I mean, none of these are her fault. I do imagine she has to deal with this.
Bad start, man. Some bad omens. So here we are at the beginning of the winter 1952. London entered this winter with its largest coal stock ever, 19.5 million tons, over 40% of which was nutty slag.
Just such a goofy name.
It is a very goofy name. At this time, at the beginning of December, meteorologists were tracking a ridge of high pressure that was creeping slowly towards the British Isles. As it came over, the ridge started to slowly circle clockwise around an eye, and this is what's known as an anticyclone. I promised we'd talk about this.
Yes, thank God.
Cyclone, it conjures up images of hurricanes, especially for us living here in Virginia. That's not what this was. It was a very high-level weather system, and the winds were circling very slowly around this really high-pressure eye. And it essentially acts like a lid on any hot air rising, which you can imagine in a city that's belching out tons of smoke is going to go really well.
Okay.
So picture that, a giant cork essentially moving slowly over the British Isles and eventually settling over London. Because of London's geography, it's more likely to have anticyclones settle over it because of the valley of the Thames. And that's where it settled down on the morning of December 5th. When the morning started, it was a pretty sunny, pretty warm for December and dry day. The skies were clear. But with this hanging over the city, temperatures started to plummet, and fog started to form in the moist air because this system was not allowing moisture to rise. It wouldn't allow for clouds to form. It was keeping everything lower to the ground. And with that moisture lower to the ground, it started to form fog. That fog started to turn into smog as it collected these particles that were belching out of all of the different factories and chimneys and different things in the city. These happened fairly often, but usually a breeze would come by and would just kind of whisk everything away. At this time, however, there was no breeze. Meteorologists fully expected this to form what was called at the time, a peace super. So in the 1500s, they called them Great Stinking Fogs. By the time we get to 1952, they're calling them pea soupers because it literally feels like you're in pea soup all of the time. Just gross, yellow, green pea soup.
Disgusting.
Yep. On each day in London, any given day, over 1,000 tons of smoke particles were belched into the air, 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 140 tons of hydrochloric acid, 14 tons of fluoride compounds, and 370 tons of sulfur dioxide.
Oh.
And none of that could dissipate. It was all getting stuck in the atmosphere near ground level because of this anticyclone.
That sounds awful.
This system settled in the morning. By around 3 o'clock, things were already starting to look like pea soup. More than 1 million chimneys, plied with nutty slack all over London, puffed out coal smoke filled with soot to keep the cold air out of their homes. There's a lot of gunk going in the air.
Yeah.
By that point, already, you could see the difference. When pigeons landed on statues or on the ground, they would kick up coal smoke. People's eyes started to redden and get sore. Throats started to get sore. Traffic started becoming a major problem. The underground was pretty consistently able to run during these pea soupers because for some reason the smoke didn't filter into the underground as much. But the roads were horrific. On December 5th, a ferry boat crashed into another boat. They shut down river traffic pretty quickly after that. And this is, again, a pretty major...
Because they couldn't see shit.
They couldn't see. But river traffic was a big deal in London.
Yeah.
So shutting that down is a big deal. Despite that, people were still out Christmas shopping because this really was not that unusual in London, this level of pea souper anyway. There were some danger signs already. Pollution monitoring stations had some pretty concerning readings. From the morning to the afternoon, some stations showed that pollutants in the air had increased 5-fold, just in the course of about 12 hours.
I mean, I'm starting to feel sick just thinking about it.
Yeah, it's pretty awful. Even though this was still a pretty regular pea souper, it took a lot of people hours longer to get home than it normally did because the buses were not running as much as they normally did. Driving your car in that weather wasn't going to happen. It was gross. And it's pretty crazy to me that that was just normal to people. No one really paid a lot of attention. These fogs would do things like tarnish buttons on coat, metal buttons.
Yeah.
Tarnish them on your coats. It would leave you covered in grime. It would get stuck in your hair. It would kind of paint your body in this layer of ick. The fog also would get inside buildings really easily, either through opening and closing doors or window panes, because a lot of these buildings didn't have, great windows. So the smoke, you weren't safe inside. It was certainly better inside, but it wasn't great. That evening is when things really started to go further south. Hospitals started having significantly more people coming in. There was a marked increase in respiratory disease. A lot of people commented on how this felt a lot like the blackouts during World War II when they'd literally cover the city in smoke on purpose to hide things from enemy planes, and then they'd shut off all power to the city so that the blitzes couldn't see what they were doing as easily. Meteorologists were telling everyone that it would get better by the next day.
It
didn't. This fog ended up lasting 5 whole days.
Ugh.
It started to get better on the 9th. Over those 5 days, it pretty much got progressively worse each and every single day. By the morning of the 6th, London woke up completely engulfed. Now, with this fog, it also came with lower temperatures just because of the way the weather system was working. So not only were they covered in this pea soup, they were burning more coal
because it
in
was
all
cold.
their homes because it was colder. The smog was this really dense, dark, yellow-green vapor. And in many, many, many places, it was so thick that you couldn't even see your hand if you stuck it out in front of you. You couldn't see your feet underneath you because visibility was that low.
Disgusting, awful, and terrifying altogether.
Isn't it just horrific? Multiple pollution monitoring stations could not measure the amount of pollutants in the air. There was too much for their systems to be able to read them.
Today's readings, it's fucked.
It's fucked. There were people literally just abandoning their cars where they were and going on foot. Some of the most haunting pictures that I saw, that they're beautiful and haunting at the same time, but the buses tried to go out And when they realized they couldn't actually make it or they were called back, they had to be brought back into the station led by people walking on foot holding flares so that the bus could follow the flare because it could not see enough to turn around and just get back to the station a few blocks away.
Wow.
There was significantly more ambulances calls than there was in previous days, but ambulances couldn't see. So the few ambulances that did make it out, again, were often led by people carrying flares to get from point A to point B. The police officers were pretty pissed at Scotland Yard. There was a lot of stories of them being really upset that they couldn't really do anything. There was several reports. Now, crime wasn't crazy high, but there were multiple reports of burglars burgling right next to a police officer within feet. They could hear the windows being broken out of like jewelry shops and other stores, but they couldn't get to the robber because they couldn't see what they were doing. So they tried, and, the robber couldn't see either, so they were getting lucky, but the police couldn't do anything about it. There was a lot of concern of people tripping and falling into the Thames, and police officers were trying to kind of monitor the shore of it to make sure they could rescue people or pull out bodies, but they couldn't see anything in it. At one point, a train crashed into
another train.
A group of rail workers, killing 2 of them and trapping others under, and it took over an hour for an ambulance to get there. All of this is happening while the hospitals are filling up. There are more and more people going in, and these are the first people that knew that there was a massive problem. The medical workers and the undertakers. Because while the hospitals were filling up, so were the mortuaries, so was the coroner's office, so were the funeral homes. It was really, really bad. Like I said, the underground was still running. It was one of the only transportation parts of the city that was still going. By Monday morning, over 3,000 people were in line for tickets at Central Station in Stratford. They had to call in extra police officers to be able to deal with the amount of public that was sitting there waiting.
Now, was it just so they could go from one place to another, or was it so they could just go underground and not be in the middle of all that?
No, they were trying to go to work. Because that was Monday morning. Most of this is happening over the weekend. People were trying to get to work Monday morning, despite how brutal all of this fog was. Yep. One of the stories that struck me was there was an ambulance that got lost in the fog with a laboring mother in it, and she ended up giving birth in it. There was a milkman who walked 6 miles on that Saturday to deliver milk to all of the people in East End that he usually delivered to, and he ended up collapsing and dropping dead at the end of his trek. There was a story of this little girl who was blind. Her mother used to pick her up from school and walk her home every day. While her mom was walking her home, the little girl stopped her suddenly because she was about to run into a wall, and she could hear the way her mother's voice echoed off the wall and recognized that the wall was there before her mom saw it, and she was inches away. The drivers that didn't end up abandoning their cars were sticking their heads out the window, driving slowly to try and see where they were going. There was multiple stories of people just collapsing in the street. Maybe not dead, but collapsing and having to be carried home or to the hospital. There was a 21-year-old sailor who collapsed in the fog. An ambulance managed to pick him up. They drove him at a walking pace to a hospital. That hospital turned them away because it was full. So they drove at a walking pace again to another hospital, and he ended up passing away in the parking lot of that hospital as soon as they arrived. Undertakers reported taking away 10 bodies from one address in Marylebone. At the hospitals, fog was dragging scum through all of the hallways, coating absolutely everything. Nurses tried to wear masks, these like white masks to block out the pollutions, and they would just immediately turn black, even inside the hospital. Every single bed in the hospitals was taken. Even the chapel was filled with people who were suffering from what was going on here. The fog itself swirled around into the wards and seemed to consist principally of smuts, so that the wash basins and baths turned darker and darker gray. It was so built up that people could write in the grime like little kids write on dirty cars.
Yeah.
The hospitals were filled primarily with people who had things like pneumonia, bronchitis, and heart failure. Shocking, I know. The death certificates for these people did not mention the fog because while doctors really knew that the fog was doing something to their patients, they didn't know exactly what it was. What they did know was things like pneumonia, bronchitis, heart failure, so that's what got put on the death certificates. Over the weekend, sulfur dioxide in the air increased from 100 parts per million to 550 parts per million.
Oh, no.
Smoke increased from 400 micrograms per cubic meter to 1,600 micrograms per cubic meter.
It's...
Throughout all of this, there were tons of sporting events that were canceled. The cinemas were closed down because people could not see the screen. So movie theaters, they couldn't see the screen from their seats in the building.
Oh, God.
The Sadler's Wells Theater was performing La Traviata on Monday, and they ended up halting the entire thing after one act, both because the audience couldn't see the stage and because the performers, this is an opera, they were having trouble singing because it was hurting their throats so much.
They were.
What was really strange about this, though, is if you were on a really tall hill in London, like Wimbledon Common, it was blue skies. All around you was the foggy grossness. But if you were up high, you were out of the smog and you weren't in danger. So there were little spots throughout England that was completely clear, beautiful, sunny, gorgeous days. Odd thing to think about, right?
Why didn't everyone go there?
Yep. So I said again that the people who really noticed first that this was a disaster was the mortuaries, was the hospitals, because people were dying really in their homes. They were dying in their beds. They would get home and they couldn't breathe and they would eventually end up passing away. It wasn't like an air raid where people were on the streets dead.
Right.
It wasn't like a hurricane where all of the buildings were destroyed. The buildings were fine. People were dying at home. The mortuaries were so full, though, that they couldn't accept more people. And because the authorities didn't really recognize that this was a disaster, there was no temporary morgue set up. So there was multiple people who just had to stay in their homes. People would end up being stuck with these dead bodies in their home for 2-3 weeks because there was no room at the mortuaries. There was no grave sites available because with no temporary mortuary, with no mass graves, there was nowhere for these bodies to go.
That's awful.
It is, but it was also very hidden. So there was not a lot of press on this. The fog was almost not mentioned at all by the newspapers, except in the context of like traffic was really, really bad.
Wow.
Yeah, kind of crazy. One of the articles that came out was titled "Hit by a Duck," one of the only ones that came out. And it was a story about a duck that was blinded by smoke and crashed into a pedestrian, and then the pedestrian took him to make him feel better. The Manchester Guardian said the business of the city cannot cease just because of a fog. I gotta tell you, Charles Dickens was a reporter in the 1830s, and I'm pretty sure Charles Dickens would have figured this out faster than the British media in 1952 did.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know. They had no idea what was going on. By December 9th, the anticyclone began to move east, and the fog started to lift. By the 10th, the city could see again. So 900 people died on December 9th alone. But over the course of the entire fog, there were 4,000 people that died in hospitals. Now, we're just talking about during the fog itself. And one of the ways they recognize how many people died in something like this when they weren't marking them down as fog deaths is they look at how many people on average die in a given week at any given time.
Okay.
So that week, for the previous however many years, only about 2,000 people died. But the week of the fog, 6,000 people died. So that extra 4,000 are considered excessive deaths, and they're attributed primarily to the fog. This is how we measured a lot of COVID deaths, too.
Okay.
The excess deaths. Because if you look at 1 week, and if that week, like let's say this week is, the last week of November, if there's only 5 people that die this week for 10 years in a row, and then suddenly 750 people die, something had to have happened to make those people die.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, it was almost certainly the fog.
Makes sense.
After the 10th, London just kind of went back to normal for the people who didn't have a dead body in their house.
Carry on.
Except for the hospitals. In the hospitals, the calamity continued. 1 out of 5 people didn't have a bed. Most hospitals canceled all elective procedures. There was no room for any regular admittance. They were sick and dying in all areas of the hospital, in the maternity wards and the dissection rooms. The mortuaries still had bodies stacked up against walls and new ones coming in. They were scattered on benches and tables and on floors. The city completely ran out of shrouds for the dead. Some hospitals even started using the chapel as a morgue because there was no more room in their morgue, and that seems like a good place for the bodies.
That's a lot.
That was a lot. There was some rumblings from other areas that people started to notice within a day or two. The Automobile Association said it responded to nearly 500 calls of stranded or crashed motorists. Ambulance services said they answered more than 600 emergency calls, more than normal. The National Smoke Abatement Society said that the damages from the fog would probably cost the city over 10 million pounds.
Did that get their attention? The loss of money?
Nope. Parliament didn't talk about the fog at all for at least 7 days. On the first day after the fog, there was a member of Parliament who did ask the government to fund chest x-rays of coal miners. He'd been asking for this for a while. That was the only mention of anything resembling coal. However, the Ministry of Health started to notice because they're in charge of all the doctors. The doctors are sending them letters like our dear, dear friend that we read earlier. So the Ministry of Health started sending out letters asking for reports from doctors that were in the area. Doctors had a difficult time kind of giving definitive causes for what was going on, especially because most of the victims of the fog already had pre-existing conditions. This was affecting people with asthma. This was affecting people who were older. This was affecting people who already had heart problems. So was it the fog that made them really sick? Or was it these pre-existing conditions? It can be hard to tell.
Well, I mean, with that much pollutants in the air for that long, the readings you were talking about from the monitoring stations just...
Right. We know that now, but while they knew air pollutants could cause death and cause illnesses, they did not have the same information that we did. A lot of the information we have now comes from studies that happened because of the 1952 fog. But yes, you're not wrong. They definitely could tell that like this fog happened and then all of a sudden thousands of people died. Probably has something to do with the fog. They started referring to these deaths as fog deaths. In the same letter that we read from earlier from Dr. Beckel, he said, "Fog deaths, I have no doubt about it whatsoever. There was a sudden and spectacular increase in cardiorespiratory deaths, which, although normally high at this time of year, was far and away above anything I had previously experienced and must be attributed to the fog with the assistance of the coal board's well-advertised nutty slack." And this was the feeling of most doctors, that like, we don't know exactly how the fog caused this, but the fog caused this. Yes, people die from this all the time, but not in these great of numbers. And it definitely has to do with the fog. And it definitely has to do with the amount of nutty slack being burnt in the city.
Yeah, makes sense.
In the United States, the Federal Security Agency, which was later renamed the Health Department, was already conducting a pretty extensive air pollution study in thanks to the 1948 Pennsylvania disaster that we talked about. When they heard about this fog, they asked Britain for information, really in-depth information about the deaths that happened, meteorological conditions, how long it lasted, maps showing the area where fatalities lived in relation to industry and other sources of pollution. The 1948 Denera tragedy really triggered the United States clean air movement, and this was a big part of that. It's what introduced the word smog into the normal vernacular. The term smog was coined in 1905, but it wasn't common until the 1948 disaster, and then, the 1952 one made it worse.
Okay.
Part of the research those people were doing proved that London was not actually a naturally foggy town. It didn't get those white fogs like we would get in San Diego. The smogs they had were almost entirely caused by air pollution.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because you always think it's got to be the literature that you talked about previously.
It was so romanticized.
You think of London
You think
City
of foggy London.
Foggy.
And it is rainy. It does rain a lot, but it's not naturally foggy. Nope. That was just romanticized and coal killing its citizens. You're welcome for ruining that for you.
All right.
So the Ministry of Health is also getting reports that the ambulances in the city were still being called at a significantly higher volume over a week later.
Well, everyone breathed in all that shit, and it's still in their lungs, so yeah.
At this point, again, over a week later, the press is finally starting to take some notice of what's going on. But we're not talking front page news. This is primarily back of the newspaper news. It was called a mysterious fog illness, and that's what was repeated in multiple newspapers. The Ministry of Health told the press, basically, there was a long-ass fog. It had lots of shit in it that can cause problems. It's nasty, but it's not mysterious. Like, we know what happened. We just don't know how bad it was. Like, this is not a Nancy Drew novel, guys. We know what's going on. When the press started to take some notice, Parliament kind of started to care, but not really. One of the members of health asked for the Minister of Health to provide statistics. The first statistics they gave was that only 519 people died in the week of the fog. And then when they were asked again, they said 2,851, most likely.
Were they just pulling shit out of their ass?
So it was a combination of them trying to downplay it and not all of the results being in.
So they were just straight making shit up?
No, the results were in. They had counted, 519 at that point, but they knew there was going to be more. So they said that because that's the number they had in front of them. What they didn't say was like, this is just preliminary. It's definitely going to go up.
Okay.
So despite the growing mounds of evidence that was coming forward from the Ministry of Health, from doctors, from all of these different places, the conservative government led by Winston Churchill really tried hard to refuse to blame pollution for it, particularly to blame coal. They did not want to blame them.
Right, because that's the industry that's paying down the debt.
Yeah. Harold Macmillan was the Ministry of Housing. And as Minister of Housing, air pollution was really under his purview. He was really just a big shill for big coal. He would say things like, you can't blame me and my colleagues for the weather. This wasn't a man-made disaster. This is definitely just fog. I don't know what you want me to do about it. And then as he got more and more pressure from these groups and from the press, he started saying things like, we're going to try and get some products on the market that use less smoke and give them to people to use in their houses. And this, sounds great in theory, but in reality, there just was not enough smokeless fuel available for anyone to actually be able to use these.
And we'll sell you something.
We'll sell you something. But something that isn't going to even do anything because there was no smokeless fuel. For the electric ones, there was huge factories in London that belched tons of coal, and that's how they produced electricity. So just giving someone an electric heater wasn't going to eliminate coal for that household.
Because they're living right next to this factory.
And the factory is using coal to make their electrical thing run. So yeah, it wasn't going to help. One of his quotes was, I am not satisfied at present that further legislation is necessary. We do what we can, but the honorable members must realize that broad economic realities must be taken into account.
I'm a giant tool.
Basically, coal is what's letting us pay off our debt. We're not going to stop producing it. We're not going to stop using it. We're not going to stop anything about this because economics matters more than people's lives.
We're making money.
Economics matters more than people's lives. That's always what it is. So 4,000 was the official total for the disaster. However, 11 months after the disaster, the government came out with a report. It was the first official report of the disaster.
All right.
That report said that 12,000 people died.
That's a pretty big number differential.
They got this by interviewing people that died after the disaster, interviewing doctors that treated patients after the disaster, and basing it off of people who got really sick during the disaster but didn't necessarily pass away while the fog was there. However, 4 months after this report came out, the Ministry of Health subtracted 8,000 deaths from the total because they decided that anyone who died after December 20th didn't count, even if they got sick during the initial disaster.
Gotta make it look better.
Gotta make it look better. I watched the documentary I was talking about that I watched. They had a funeral director who was working at this time, and he was talking about usually we would have 60 funerals a month. That's how many we dealt with. In December, we had 104. In January, a further 104. In February, 102. And March, 80. We were still having people who were dying, more than there should have been people dying. And it was definitely due to the fog. The ministry, when pushed on this, said that there was more people dying because there was a flu epidemic. There was no evidence of an extensive flu epidemic. The World Health Organization itself was like, we looked at what you put out there, and about 400 people of those 8,000 died from the flu. That's not an epidemic.
Right.
And come on, there's people dying here. At this point, there's over 6 million Britons that are at risk, and the government is being pushed hard by clean air lobbyists. So the government decides, I'm going to put it off. And they didn't do anything until 1953. More specifically, they didn't do anything useful until then. They started a mask campaign where they encouraged people to wear a lot of masks. They had already done research showing that masks were functionally ineffective against pollution. At one point, the United States government offered to sell them 100,000 gas masks, which sounds great, right? Sounds cool.
It sounds like a drop in the bucket.
Part of the deal for that, though, was if they took it, all of the gas masks had to have advertisements for United States cigarettes and how good their filter is.
Oh.
Yeah, the government ended up turning that down.
Wow.
In 1953, the chief medical officer of the Ministry of Health suggested that they take a tunnel, fill it with smoke, and put people in it to study the effects of air pollution to better understand it. Yep, their plans were not great. They clearly were taking this very seriously.
We need to scrub some more people's lungs to study the effects.
What a stupid plan.
That is.
What a stupid plan.
Were they going to be volunteers or conscripts?
Volunteers. And they actually had volunteers. There was people writing to the Ministry of Health, volunteering and wanting to do it. And they were saying things like, look, I'm going to die from the smog anyway, or I have a chance of dying. If I do it this way, at least it's going to help science and help make things better.
I mean, there's logic in that.
There were some people that were fighting really hard. There was enough that by 1954, the government ended up appointing Sir Hugh Beaver to chair a committee on air pollution.
He has a very unfortunate name.
I know his name. But that committee ultimately recommended that clean air should become a more essential part of fuel policy in the future. Their recommendations included things like ways to make industrial smoke cleaner, changing house coal to smokeless fuels, and considering this would be such a radical change in domestic heating habits, they recommended that the government pay for a lot of these changes. And that led to the 1956 and 1968 Clean Air Acts. So there was a change. It took a decent amount of time, and it took a lot of kind of radicals pushing the government to be able to get there, because there never was a ton of press coverage on this killer fog. There was some. It was not completely out of the news, but it definitely was not at the forefront of the national conversation or anything like that.
It took the people realizing that their friends and family were dying, pushing.
I wouldn't even say that. It took activists pushing the government and not shutting up about it, because there wasn't a huge public outcry. You'd think there would be, but there wasn't. And I understand why. Again, unlike a lot of disasters that we talked about and we're going to talk about, there weren't people dead in the streets. Like, there was a few people that collapsed in the streets, but there weren't people dead in the streets. There weren't any destroyed buildings. There wasn't any, there was obviously some damage. It cost some money, but the money was mostly in human lives. You couldn't look out the door after the smog and see anything amiss. City looked fine. Everything was hidden behind closed doors. So I get why there wasn't as much of a public outcry as there could have been in other things. But the Clean Air Act of 1956 and 1968, these acts both banned the emissions of black smoke. They decreed residents of urban areas and operators of factories had to switch over to smokeless fuels. People were given a lot of time to adapt to these new rules. So the fogs did continue pretty consistently for some time after the 1956 Act was passed. For example, in 1962, 750 Londoners died from a fog. So super great. So that all sounds well and good, and it did definitely clear up the air significantly. However,
there's the however.
As we were switching over to smokeless fuels, we were also starting to see more and more cars on the road. We were starting to see more and more other types of pollution, the kind of pollution that you and I know today. And a lot of that pollution really doesn't show as much. It's there, but it's not as visible to the naked eye.
Right, the smog in Southern California, you don't see it when you're in it.
Nope.
You can only see it when you're above it.
At a distance, yep. In 1991, there was a 3-week fog. It wasn't a fog that people could see, but for 3 weeks, air pollution levels went up significantly in London. Over 160 people died. And it happened the same way the 1952 one did. There was an anticyclone. It trapped all of the pollutants. It just wasn't visible. So there wasn't a huge outcry. There wasn't a lot done.
Crazy.
Today, 29 to 43,000 Britons die every single year as a result of air pollution. And over 7 million people worldwide die as a result of air pollution. Just so that you can sleep at night and feel better.
Well, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
I'm going to be thinking about that for a while.
I don't mean to get too radical or anything, but it is still definitely kind of an ongoing catastrophe. Millions of people die every single year from this. And I don't really know what the solutions are. It's not my job, thank God.
Right.
So I'm not good at these things, but it is a thing that exists out there. And it's worth keeping an eye on your air quality app, depending on where you live.
Well, I definitely remember being in high school in Bakersfield, California, and having school delayed or canceled altogether for bad air quality.
I was thinking about
Or we were told don't go outside.
Yeah,
if you can avoid it.
That's a thing in San Diego too. But for us, it was because of wildfires. So I remember growing up when we had the bad air quality days, it's because there was wildfires nearby. And that would create a very similar to like pea soup experience. And we had to wear masks or not go outside or not deal with things. Like it's kind of nuts how often that still happens.
Well, I do remember when the Malibu fires were going on. And I was in college in San Diego, and there was ash coming down on us in San Diego. The skies were dark, and this ash was falling like snowflakes, basically, from Malibu.
That was just kind of a piece of my childhood. Every couple of years, there was fires, and I lived in East County. So I lived near a lot of the wildfires that happened on the outskirts of San Diego. And there was multiple times where, like, the car would be covered in ash or whatever. I remember one time when I was in high school, it was a particularly bad air day. And my friends and I decided to try and be cool. And we walked to 7-Eleven. Because we were just so badass. And all three of us were hacking and coughing by the end of that walk that we had to call my friend's mom to come pick us up because we could barely breathe. We were all healthy young women, There is nothing wrong with us that would have caused problems, but walking that 2 miles in that fog. So I have a lot of sympathy for the people who lived through this. What a horrific thing. And to do it every year pretty much. Not every year as bad as 1952, but there was fogs every year that happened in London. There's obviously still smogs that happen in multiple cities. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's certainly perspective altering to think about it that way.
Very much so. So, think about that. Sleep well. Yeah. Hope you feel better. That's my whole story.
I want a shower now.
I'm definitely.
What I really want.
We all need a shower. Wash off some of that grime. So that concludes our episode on the 1952 smog.
Thanks for joining us. Everyone stay safe.
We have socials.
Oh, shit.
If you want to help the pod, I put a tip jar on our website and a couple of our socials. And if you guys want to help contribute so that we can pay for some of our hosting stuff and maybe eventually upgrade to new equipment, that would be awesome. Don't feel obligated, but it's there in case you feel the need. We also have socials we would love for you to follow us on. We're on Facebook, Blue Sky, X, Instagram, Threads, Talk. I don't know. We're everywhere, which is pretty fun. And they're all pretty much Catastrophe Chronicles. For show notes, check out our website, www.catastrophe-chronicles.com. We are so glad that you came today. We are so happy to be here with you, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week. Sometime in the next couple of weeks, we're actually going to have Aaron tell us a story, which I'm really excited about.
Me too.
I don't know if it'll be next week or the week after, but it'll be soon. So you've got that to look forward to. And with that,
everyone stay safe.
And stay curious.